probably not as exciting as a lot of the spots are. And I'll show you why in a few minutes. Let me see if I can get over here and turn and get rid of that thing that's up in the screen. Where's my mic? Okay, where'd it go? There's, okay.
I removed it. Honey,
What?
I removed mine.
I don't know what you mean. Well, there was a little thing shining up here that said that it was.
Leave or cancel?
Recording. I'm sorry?
That you're recording?
Yes.
I took mine off my computer
That's okay.
myself.
I got rid of mine.
Okay.
It's good. Thank you.
All right.
Anyway, y'all can't hear, I can hear. That's Mary. She's doing well and probably be back with us sometime soon, but still a little skittish about being out in crowds. Thank you for those of you who've asked about my mother. She is not doing very well. She's in the hospital and they've been having to increase her oxygen and she's just pretty much getting worn out. So I don't know how that's going to play out, but anyway, keep her in your prayers, please. Okay, we started off 2 weeks ago with Lydda and Joppa, and then last week we started with Caesarea. And how many of you guys liked Caesarea? Isn't that cool? I mean, how many of you had any idea about what a builder Herod the Great was? That was one of the things which was an eye-opener to me. Today we're going to talk about Mount Carmel, but before we do, we're going to do a song. And I got to get my mouse back over here where it belongs now. There we go. This song doesn't come right from our text, but I think it plays right into our text. The point where Elijah says with the people there at Mount Carmel, he prays to God before he offers his sacrifice. O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant, that I've done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, that you have turned their hearts back. And then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. So let's sing, great and mighty is the Lord our God.
Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he. Lift up the banner, let the anthems ring. Praises to our King. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he. Lift up your banner, let the anthems ring. Praises to our King. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he. Lift up your banner, let the anthems ring. Praises to our King. Great and mighty is the Lord our God. Great and mighty is he.
All right. So, wasn't that a good sermon this morning? All right. What was the most interesting thing you heard in today's sermon? Oh, good times and bad times. And we all have them, don't we? And we have the best of the best and the worst of the worst. The one thing we can know is that God is good in the good and the bad times. Okay? Anything else? Okay. All things work together for good to those who love the Lord. I've told you about my friend, those have been ambassadors. I've told you about my friend Lula Mae Haynes. She was a farmer's wife back in West Texas when I was preaching there. She was in a very small town. I was in the big city of Dimmitt, which was 5,000. She was in a little town, about 700 people, Hart, Texas. They had a good church, a big church there for the size of the community. And then one year, the preacher and all of the elders took a plane trip to visit a missionary they were supporting. They all crashed in the Colorado mountains, and they didn't find their bodies till the next year. And so here she was, and these are farmers, and they don't farm in terms of acres, they farm in terms of sections. You know what a section is? It's 1 mile square, okay, 1 mile on each side. And they, how much do you farm? I farm 3 sections, I farm 7 sections, or whatever. Big farm, okay? He had a crop in the field. If they didn't get the crop out of the field, they wouldn't be able to pay the bank, they'd lose the farm, and here her husband died in a plane crash, And she said, well-meaning people came to her and said, all things work together for good to them that love the Lord. And she said, I didn't see anything good come out of it. But when I was preaching in Dimmitt, she was a member there. And honestly, there were 2 boys. One of them, it drew him close to the Lord. One of them, it turned him away from the Lord. The thing is, we can't always see the good that God does. We just can't always see that. But anyway, that's good. Okay, I love the C.S. Lewis quote, one of my favorites. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Have you ever noticed how when bad times come, as they used to say, there are no atheists in foxholes? Right? You've heard that, right? Okay, when bad times come, everybody hits the knee. All right. Some of the things Ricky said, we can rest assured that in our suffering, Jesus knows. Psalm 139, Jesus sees. Psalm 32, Jesus cares. I remember doing a sermon years ago, back in my preaching days, where I made the point between 2 songs that we used to sing. I come from an a cappella background, a background where we sing without instruments. And so we had a lot of 4-part harmony and a lot of that kind of stuff. But I remember that I did this sermon one time, and it was based on 2 songs. One song you may have heard, does Jesus care when my heart is pained too deeply for mirth and song? Okay. And of course, that song is, oh, yes, he cares. I know he cares. But then I went to another song. That was, no one ever cared for me like Jesus. And there was a reason I put those 2 songs together, because in the New Testament, in the Gospels, when you read about Jesus feeling toward broken people, destitute people, needy people, hungry people, there's a word that's used to describe Jesus in the Gospels that's not used to describe anybody else. And that is the word, Greek word, splachnitzomai. Splachnitzomai is based on the word for internal organs, the guts, okay? Have you ever been so affected by something you've seen that it feels like it's tied your stomach up in knots? That's the idea of that word. And that's the word that's found when it says he was moved with compassion. He was moved with compassion. That word is only used in the Gospels, and it's only used in 2 contexts. One, it describes Jesus. It never describes anyone else. So that no one ever cared for me like Jesus really does fit. But the second thing is, it's used by Jesus in describing the way we ought to be. The father of the prodigal son was moved with compassion. The Samaritan was moved with compassion. So it's either talking about Jesus or Jesus talking about how we ought to be, but it never is there to describe how we are. Just a thought. Anyway. All right. Another thing. In Job, we see the problem of suffering, the purpose of suffering, and the process of suffering. And his following Job's model, we must do three things: immerse our minds in God's word, invest our time with God's people, indulge our hearts with God's presence. I love the way he does alliteration. You know? All right. Okay. We got lots of stuff to cover today. I'm going to start with something that kind of picks up on a question I was asked last week. Last week, I was asked the question, I don't recall who asked it, at the end of the class, about why there is such conflict in Israel all the time, why there is such conflict. And I'm going to give you a view of that conflict that you may never see, okay? Now, before I say this, I'm not taking a political position. Let me put this up here and let me just show you. Put yourself in the mind of a Palestinian, okay? Don't put yourself in the mind of a Jew. Don't put yourself in the mind of a Christian who believes that the Jews ought to be occupying the land, okay? Put yourself in the mind of a Palestinian. Can you do that with me? Okay. This is the way Israel looked at World War I. Totally Palestinian. In fact, it was called Palestine. At the end of World War I, the British, there was a thing called the British Mandate, where the British actually brought Jews into Palestine and settled them. And this is the way it looked. The green is where the Jews settled. The yellow is where the Palestinians were. After World War II, the United Nations decided it would be a good idea, especially in light of the Holocaust, to resettle European Jews in Israel and give them a homeland. Now, that's the way it looked after that. It was formed in 1948-49. Notice that at the beginning, Jerusalem is in Palestinian territory. Later on, the West Bank, which is the yellow part there, the West Bank was cut through Jerusalem to give a part of Jerusalem to the Jewish people, okay? That's 1949. 1967, you may remember the 6-Day War, right? Six-Day War, like that. And then in the present, this is the way it looks. One of these days, this is not the worst thing that could happen. Actually, one day I was up here talking and this fell on me. Okay, it didn't hit me because somebody jumped up from the chair and kept it from me. Anyway, this is the way it looks now. Now, if you were a Palestinian, how would you feel about looking at that map? Huh? Yeah. That gives you a perspective you probably haven't ever seen before, okay? And that's in 115 years, okay? Now then, this is the way the West Bank, well, this is the way Israel looks today. What I've done is I've taken that last map, and this map shows the zones in what's called the West Bank. The West Bank is divided into 3 zones. It's A, B, and C. Zones A are zones that are entirely governed by Palestinian Authority. Zone B are governed by a joint Palestinian and Israeli Authority. Zone C is governed by Israel alone, okay? So what you've got here is all of the area that's marked Israel is totally autonomous Israeli. You've got parts here that are Israeli occupied. You've got parts here that are joint, and you've got parts here that are totally Palestinian. So even in the West Bank, they've got situations where the Palestinians are not autonomous. Now, I don't know what reason they're going to give us that we don't go into Bethlehem. I can tell you why we're not going into Bethlehem. We're not going into Bethlehem because Bethlehem, you have to go through Israeli security to get in, and you have to go through Israeli security to get out. And when you go in, they'll tell you, be good, because if you get in trouble, we can't help you. That's the same thing they told us when they took us to San Quentin as a bunch of new judges. Okay, so what you'll notice is the places we go in Israel are all the places in that light shaded area. We won't be going into the areas that are red. And that's the reason. So you could look at that and you could say, well, the United States and Europe shouldn't be meddling in what's going on over there. You could look at it and say, well, the Lord said that Israel gets the land. And so I'm not arguing one side or the other. I'm just saying, if I were a Palestinian, I wouldn't like the situation either. Would you? Okay. That's why. And if you want to see a really good book on this, there's a novel that was written by Richard North Patterson, and it's called Exodus. And it is a really good, it's a novel, but it gives you a really good perspective of this Israel-Palestinian conflict from both sides. Okay? So there we go on that. Okay, now then, let's talk about Mount Carmel. Here's a picture, an aerial view of Mount Carmel. This area down here is where we're going to be focusing on. This is an overview of the Jezreel Valley from Mount Carmel. We'll see it again shortly. Okay, that's enough of that. We'll walk. Actually, that's not a bad walk, because where the bus parks, you see it in a minute. Well, I'll show you the bus parking lot in a minute. Okay, Mount Carmel. Most people, when you say mount, you think of a peak, right? Okay, Mount Carmel is not a peak. It is a range. It's a range about 15 miles long that runs from Haifa, which is that jut out of the Mediterranean Sea, down past the area that says Mount Carmel. And it actually comes about 15 miles down to Megiddo, which is the place we'll talk about next week, and then even further down. It's a mountain range that runs kind of northwest to southeast, okay? Now, then we talked previously about Lydda and Joppa. We talked about Caesarea Maritima. At the top of the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea, at the top of the plain of Sharon, there is where Mount Carmel range is. And so this is what the Jezreel Valley looks like. We're going to talk about Jezreel Valley this week and next. I got a video next week that I think you'll really enjoy. Couldn't decide whether to show it today or show it next week, and I think it fits better with Megiddo than with Mount Carmel, so we're going to do it there. But this is looking from Mount Carmel. You're standing on a platform at this point. You're standing on a platform across. That's not mine, is it? Okay, no, it's not. Well, you're standing on a platform at that monastery, looking across the Jezreel Valley. The Jezreel Valley is also called the Plain of Esdraelon, which is Greek for Jezreel. It's also called the Valley of Armageddon. Okay, that's the Jezreel Valley right there. Okay, as you look across, you can see, if you're looking east, you can see Mount Tabor. Cana is a little further past Mount Tabor. Nazareth is kind of on this side of Mount Tabor. You've got Mount Morah, or the Hill of Morah is what you usually see it called in the New Testament. Nain and Shunem are a couple of places I'm going to mention. I'm going to mention Shunem in a Anybody remember what happened at Nain? Anybody remember what happened at Nain? Widow of Nain, remember that? Woman burying her son. Jesus comes and raises her son from the dead at Nain. Anybody remember what happened at Cana? Water to wine. By the way, you'll get a chance to buy some water, some of that wine in Cana. Guarantee you Jesus didn't make it. It ain't good. Okay. Of course, we know what happened at Nazareth. Shunem, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And then Mount Gilboa, which is where Saul and his sons died. And then Ein Harod, that's where Gideon selected the 300 men. God selected the 300 men to go against the enemy. And then Jezreel, which at this point in time we're talking about, was the capital of Israel. Israel had 3 capitals during the Old Testament period of First Kings. This is if you're going up the Via Maris, you're running up the plain of Sharon. This is you seeing Mount Carmel. Now you're headed north and you see that. What are you going to do? Go around, right? Okay, that's what you're going to do. Exactly. So let's talk about the major routes in the land of the Bible. Oh, incidentally, I saw where Chuck's bought that satellite Bible atlas. I'm jealous. I'm going to have to get one. It's great. I looked at it. It's fantastic. But this is a video that has to do with that particular book.
Shalom and welcome to the Satellite Bible Atlas, video number 3, Major Routes in the Land of the Bible. In our last video, we learned about the 4 major geographical regions of the Bible: the coastal plain, the hill country, the Rift Valley, and the Transjordan Plateau. Now we will see how each of these regions has a major route that runs through it. Knowing the major routes of the land is important because towns and cities are often located along the routes. The Bible records hundreds of events that happen to people at real locations along these routes. Using map 116, we will mark out 4 major routes. First is the coastal highway, sometimes called the Way of the Sea, which more or less runs unimpeded along the relatively flat coastal plain. The coastal highway is a major section on the international route that joins Egypt to Mesopotamia. However, note Mount Carmel, which is a barrier to travel. Later, we will see how the route traverses Mount Carmel through a pass to the Jezreel Valley, then to the Sea of Galilee and further north. The second route travels north-south on the watershed of the hill country. This route is called the Road of Patriarchs because Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph frequently traveled on it. The third route is the Rift Valley. The flat plain provides convenient travel between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee and further beyond to the north. The fourth route runs north-south along the Transjordan Plateau. The route is called the King's Highway. Further to the north, the Bible calls the route the way to Bashan. The route continues beyond Bashan to Damascus. Let's see these same routes on map 1-2, where they appear finely highlighted in yellow already. Here is the International Coastal Highway, smooth sailing using Mount Carmel. Then the route uses a valley pass that runs through Mount Carmel and into the Jezreel Valley. Note the city of Megiddo, which functions as a center guarding the pass through Mount Carmel. Megiddo, the city mentioned in both the Old and New Testaments, draws its historical significance from the layout of the regions and the routes. From the Jezreel Valley, the route continues down toward the Sea of Galilee and further north off the map. This route, in all of its sections, is known as the Great International Route that connects Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Road of the Patriarchs does not appear in yellow on map 1-2, since it is more of a local route. However, you can trace it. Remember, it follows the watershed in the hill country. From Beersheba in the south, follow it past the cities of Hebron, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Bethel, Shiloh, and Shechem. Then it descends into the Jezreel Valley, where it joins the international route. The Rift Valley route connects the Dead Sea to the Sea of Galilee. We've marked it out on the east side of the Rift Valley along the foot of Gilead. Finally, the King's Highway comes through Moab, along the plateau, past Rabat Ammon and Gilead, north through Bashan, and off the map toward Damascus. Using map 115, let's take a closer look at why the Jezreel Valley is a hub for routes. Note that this map is east-oriented, north is to the left. The Jezreel Valley is a wide, flat, triangular, or arrowhead-shaped plain that breaks the hill country. It is a hub of routes, since it is the easiest place to cross east-west through the land of the Bible. We've already seen how the great international route comes along the coastal plain and then utilizes the Jezreel Valley, avoiding the high hill country as it makes its way northeast. Note likewise how traffic crossing east-west, joining both the Rift Valley route and the King's Highway with the Mediterranean Sea, also avoids high hill country by passing through the Jezreel Valley. As the most convenient east-west crossing in the land of the Bible, the Jezreel Valley is an intersection of international routes. There are many biblical events that occurred in the Jezreel Valley because it is the #1 way to cross east-west through the country. There is the wide Jezreel Valley, looking from Mount Carmel as far as Gilead in Transjordan, and the ruins of ancient Megiddo overlooking the Jezreel Valley. Across the valley are the Nazareth Ridge, Mount Tabor, and the Hill of Moreh. As in biblical times, the modern highway comes through the Megiddo Pass into the Jezreel Valley. There are other east-west passages through the hill country, but none are as convenient as the Jezreel Valley. Note on this cross-section sketch how difficult it is to travel from the Mediterranean Sea to Transjordan to the hill country near Jerusalem. Leaving the coastal plain, one ascends nearly 3,000 feet to the hill country watershed, then descends over 4,000 feet into the valley. The ascent to Transjordan is another 4,000-foot climb. In comparison, traveling west to east via the Jezreel Valley involves a relatively flat journey and ascent of a little over 200 feet.
Hey, I'm standing here on a ridge in the city of Nazareth, and behind me is the Jezreel Valley. To my right, you can see Mount Tabor, where Deborah and Barak gathered 10,000 Israelites to go to battle against the Canaanites. And then to my left, you can see Mount Moreh, where on the slope is the city of Nain. And just after Jesus announced that he had the authority to raise the dead, he raised widow's son. And that's it.
All right, so I think it's important to understand the routes because they're going to, in fact, when we get to Capernaum, there's going to be a quotation that Matthew ties to Jesus putting his ministry in Capernaum that talks about the way of the sea, Galilee of the Gentiles. And if you didn't know about these routes, you wouldn't realize he's talking about Capernaum being on a major highway. But that's what's going on here, okay? So there's a basic look at it. Legio in this particular one is what the Romans called Megiddo. And Carmel is not shown here, just the range is seen here. But that's the basic routes that we're talking about. So this week and next, we're going to talk about two of the major sentinels that stand over the plain of Jezreel. And there are two passes from the international route, the way of the sea, that go. Most people went through this major pass at Megiddo, and that is the highway we will actually go on to get to Megiddo. So that's the main highway. Others went through what's called the Jokneam Pass. It's a smaller pass, and it wasn't as prominent because obviously if you're coming from south to north or you're headed from north to south, which of the two cuts out mileage? You know, going across the Jezreel Valley to Megiddo rather than coming here and then having to go a little up north and then back down, it just makes more sense. So the Megiddo Pass is the one that's probably going to get more traffic. But Mount Carmel, it's a range, 15-mile range. The Bible talks a lot about Mount Carmel. It talks about its beauty. Places like Song of Songs 7:5. Your head crowns you like Mount Carmel. Your hair is like royal tapestry. The king is held captive by its tresses. How would you like that, women, if your husband says, wow, your head looks like a tree? Okay. How about this one? The land mourns and wastes away. He's talking about the destruction of the land. Lebanon is ashamed and withers. Sharon, that's that plain, is like the Arabah, and Bashan and Carmel drop their leaves. That's Isaiah 33, verse 9. It's when the Bible talks about fruitfulness, sometimes it talks about Carmel. Isaiah 35, 1 and 2. Like the crocus, it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Sometimes it's used to describe majesty. As surely as I live, declares the King, whose name is the Lord Almighty. One will come who is like Tabor among the mountains, like Carmel by the sea. You ever wondered where Clint Eastwood got the name of that place? That's Clint. Is that Clint Eastwood? Okay, Carmel by the sea. Okay, prosperity. It was used to describe prosperity. But I will bring Israel back to his own pasture, and he will graze on Carmel and Bashan. His appetite will be satisfied on the hills of Ephraim and Gilead. And then it's also used to describe judgment. The Lord roars from Zion and thunders from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds dry up, and the top of Carmel withers. Or though they hide themselves on the top of Carmel, there I will hunt them down and seize them. Though they hide from me at the bottom of the sea, there I will command the serpent to bite them. Or he rebukes the sea and dries it up. He makes all the rivers run dry. Bashan and Carmel wither, and the blossoms of Lebanon fade. All of these descriptions about beauty and majesty and judgment, all of those things are descriptions that we see about Carmel. And there's a picture of the Carmel range. Now, when we're driving through the Carmel range, you're going to see some stuff. You're going to go, wow, I had no idea there was some. You're going to see a whole bunch of Rolling Stone tombs. And no, Mick Jagger's not there. You'll see Rolling Stone tombs. They're just all over the place as you drive through the Mount Carmel range. There's a picture of the Mount Carmel forest. It's a very beautiful area. There's some gorgeous areas in Israel. Now, this is not in Carmel. This is in Tyre, about 50 miles above Carmel in what we call Lebanon. In the Old Testament days, it would be called Syria or Phoenicia. Okay, but this is a Baal temple. Baal. Anybody know who Baal is? We just, I'm from Texas. We call him Baal. But the word is Baal. Baal was the Canaanite god. Okay. Now, why am I showing you a temple in Tyre up in Lebanon? I think I'll explain to you in a few minutes. Actually, this is a Baal temple. This is you read the Bible of high places. When you read of a high place, that's a place where they built a temple elevated, and so the priest had to walk steps to climb up to where God was. That's a high place. There's the steps up to the high place at the altar, at the temple of Baal. This is Baal's throne at that temple in Tyre, and this is Asherah's throne. Asherah, Baal, Asherah, or Asherah, thought of as the god and goddess of the weather, the rain. And so when spring would come, it would come because people were worshiping Baal and Asherah, and they brought this fruition back to the land. Maybe that plays into our story today. Now, I don't know if you remember or not, the background of the showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, the 850 combined prophets of Baal and Asherah on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18, that was really set in motion about 100 years earlier. David's son Solomon, he knew good and well what God's commandment was about marrying foreign women. But he did it anyway. And it wasn't a mistake that he made once. He made it 1,000 times. He had a whole bunch of wives and a whole bunch of cucumber vines, concubines. And incidentally, concubines, people get, what's a concubine? A concubine is basically what you used to call in the Southeast a common law wife. In places, even in Texas, you can still do this. You can get married in a ceremony and with a marriage license, Or if you shack up and represent yourself as husband and wife, you can actually become husband and wife that way. And so that's kind of what you're talking about there when you talk about concubines. All right. So in 1 Kings 11, verses 1-8, we read about Solomon marrying all these foreign women. Well, the thing about these foreign women is they had all these foreign gods, and they needed a place to worship their foreign gods. So what does Solomon do? He builds a bunch of foreign temples so that they can worship their foreign gods. And so in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 9 and following, Solomon is told God's going to rip the kingdom out of his hand, but not his. He's going to take it out of his son's hand. Out of respect for David, he's going to take it out in the days of Rehoboam. And so when Solomon dies, Rehoboam comes to the throne, and one of Solomon's former officials, Jeroboam, leads a revolt against Rehoboam, and Rehoboam is left with essentially 2 tribes of Israel, and Jeroboam is left essentially with 10 tribes of Israel up in the north. Well, Jeroboam gets this idea. You know what? All of our people come from the same stock, the same background, the same religion, and so they're going to be going back to Jerusalem to worship. Well, he doesn't want them doing that, because if they go back to Jerusalem, they may think about going back to, one kingdom, and he'd lose his kingdom. So what he does is he builds 2 altars, one in Bethel, just across the border of Judah, and another one way up north in Dan that we'll actually visit. We'll see the high place in Dan while we're there. Incidentally, when you're at the high place in Dan, between about from here to that wall right there is a barbed wire fence. You cross that barbed wire fence and you're in Lebanon. It's right there. Okay. So that's what's going on there in the northern kingdom. Now, Carmel, you'll notice, is in the northern kingdom, right? It's up in north. So we're focused on north right now. About 50 years after Solomon, there's a king on the throne you may have heard of. His name was Ahab. And he wasn't an Arab. Ahab, king of Israel, married a foreign wife named Jezebel. Jezebel, according to 1 Kings 16:31, was the daughter of a priest king of Sidon. You've heard of Tyre and Sidon. A priest king whose name was Ethbaal. He's known historically as Ithobaal the first. He established a dynasty. Now, the name Baal, just like in the Hebrew, a lot of people's names have El in them. El, you know what El stands for? God, right? Okay, so whenever you read El, it's something about God. Bethel, house of God, okay? When you read Baal, you got somebody who's a Baal worshiper, right? So anyway, so Jezebel is the daughter of a priest in Tyre named Ithobaal or Ethbaal. So she grew up going to that temple I was showing you. That's what she was familiar with. So guess what? She needed a place to practice her Baal worship in Israel. So guess what? Solomon built her a place. She needed some priests. So Solomon brought her some priests, 850 of them. They were fed in the palace. They lived in the palace. They were cared for in the palace. They were supported by the public economy. And Ahab even built a Baal temple in Samaria, his new capital, when he built it. There's a picture of the remains of the Baal temple in Samaria. All right. So that's what was going on. So this is where we are. Now, what I've got here on this, you're not going to see these particular things when we go there because they're in that that Palestinian controlled territory. This is the ruins of Ahab's palace in Samaria. That's called the Ivory Palace. Know that we didn't get the song from that. Out of the Ivory Palace. We didn't get that song from that. This is called Ahab's Ivory Palace. He built it in Samaria. And the reason it's called the Ivory Palace is because it was decorated by a whole lot of ivory. And what you've got here is some of the things that were found there. You've got a cult prostitute from the Baal worship. In each of these windows, what you've got is basically, what is it, Beale Street in New Orleans? Is that the one? The one where everybody goes to, where the women are hanging out the windows and all that stuff? Okay, anyway. What's that? Oh, Beals in Memphis? Okay, that's why my brother is. Okay. Okay, yeah, Beale Street's barbecue. What? Bourbon Street, that's the one. You can tell I don't spend much time. Anyway, these are the women looking out the windows, trying to drum up business. That's what those are. Guess where they found those? In Ahab's ivory palace. Okay, here's another set of them here. There's one of the cult prostitutes. And then there's also this winged guardian and the infant on a lotus. Now, I'm showing you these because one of the things we'll see when we're in Israel, when you go to a Jewish area where the people were observant Jews, you will not see images of people and animals. Why? Second commandment, don't make images, right? And they took it seriously. But you go to Samaria and you see a lot of that because they're bringing in the Baal worship, the foreign god worship. They're bringing that stuff in and creating those things. Okay, so that's kind of putting you in context of why Jezebel has all these Baal prophets there. All right. So here's Mount Carmel, looking at it again, where the showdown took place between Elijah and the prophets of Baal and Asherah. Now, the first thing you read about is in 1 Kings 17:1, Ahab goes to the king and he says, it ain't going to rain again until I say so. And then he goes away. And 3.5 years later, James tells us, over 3 years, the Old Testament tells us, James says 3.5 years later is when the drought ends. Now, what happens if you don't get a drop of rain or any dew for 3 years?
Bad shit.
Look out here, right? Go down the Salton Sea, take a look there. That's what it looks like, right? Okay. That's the background here. Okay. Carmel is withered. And so there's just, it's been dry and there's no water. The rivers have dried up. And here we are at Carmel. Carmel from ancient times was a place where Baal worship was engaged in. Baal and Asherah are the god and goddess of fertility, the rain, right? So if it's been dry for 3 years, who's not doing their work? Baal and Asherah, right? They're not doing their work. So I think that probably is the setup for this whole thing. Elijah says you're going to have 3 years to think about who really controls everything. And at the end of that time, we're going to find out, right? And so
That didn't go quite like
they're
that.
going to find in the Carmel area, this is something else you'll find. A lot of caves there. You'll read, for example, in 1 Kings 18, where Obadiah had been hiding some prophets of God from Jezebel. She's trying to kill all the prophets of God. Obadiah's been hiding them. Obadiah works in Ahab's household. He's the steward of Ahab's house. And so he is secretly hiding away and taking care of these prophets of the Lord while Jezebel is out trying to kill them all. And he's hiding them in caves like that one. This cave has prehistoric remains in it. So there's been people in here for centuries, okay? So in the 3rd year of the drought, Elijah appears to Obadiah outside of one of these things. And he says, go down and tell Ahab I'm looking for him. You kidding? He's been looking for you. And so when Elijah meets up with Ahab, he says, we're going to find out who's really in control of the weather now. I want you to gather all the prophets of Baal and Asherah. I want to meet me on Mount Carmel, which is Baal territory, and we're going to have us a showdown. So this is the kind of stuff Baal is supposed to control, the place where he's supposed to control it from. And so Elijah's going to the visiting side of the field, right? He's going to the enemy territory to put on this contest. This is a picture of the monastery that marks the place of the contest. It's on a peak that's called Muraqa, Muhraqa or Muhraka. You'll see it spelled both ways. It is a Carmelite, go figure, they call it Carmelite. It's on top of Mount Carmel. Okay. Anyway, it's a Carmelite monastery that sits right above the location where this is supposed to have taken place. And I think this is probably the right location. It fits all of the criteria of the location in the scriptures in a way that no other place really does. Well, here's the showdown at Mount Carmel.
Elijah, one of the greatest prophets who has ever lived, was born in Gilead, which is located in modern-day Jordan. This hilltop marks the reputed place of his birth, but it was across the river in Israel where his most significant work would take place. At the time, Israel was in deep sin and apostasy, and they were worshiping Baal instead of God. This pleased Elijah greatly, and the time came when God told him to go to the king's palace with a warning of judgment. At the time, Israel was split. There was the northern tribe and the southern, and he went to King Ahab, who was presiding over the northern tribe. Elijah made his way into the king's palace, where he walked straight before the king and declared that it would not rain for 3 years because of Israel's sin. After making a swift exit, he was nowhere to be found, and the warning soon spread across the land. Elijah found refuge firstly by the brook Cherith, and then after it had dried up, he went to the widow of Zarephath, where miraculously they were sustained as the flour and oil was replenished each day. At the end of 3 years, the land was parched, people had died, and Elijah was called by God to speak to the king again. Appearing before the king who showed despised him, Elijah told him to meet him along with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel was known for its lush green beauty, but it had dried up, and it would be the place for the showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, between the true God and false God. As the people gathered there, Elijah cried out to them, "How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, then follow him, but if Baal, follow him." No one responded. Elijah then set the ground rule. There would be 2 bulls chosen, 2 altars made. The prophets of Baal were to go first, and they had to call down fire from heaven. All day they cried out to their gods, but nothing happened. At the end of the day, they were out of ideas, and it was now Elijah's turn. He instructed that 12 pots of water be poured on the altars first. Then humbly crying out to God, he called for God to show to the people that he was the real God. As Elijah ended his prayer, fire descended from heaven and consumed the altar. The sight was stunning, and the people who had seen this contrast between God and Baal cry out, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." The prophets of Baal, though, were still unrepentant, and they were destroyed. And then Elijah, in the midst of the blinding rain that fell, led King Ahab's chariot back to his house. Upon hearing about the day's events from King Ahab, his wife Jezebel wasn't impressed and was even more determined to kill Elijah. When Elijah heard this, fear and despair overtook him, and he ran away, eventually ending up in Mount Horeb after a 40-day journey. Elijah went through an experience that many of us do, in that after his great spiritual victory here on Mount Carmel, he went through a time of deep despair and discouragement. Oftentimes, we can be prone to doubt and depression right after a spiritual high. Whilst in horror and wondering if there would ever be a revival and reformation in Israel, God came to him and told him that he had 7,000 that had still not bowed the knee to Baal. Sometimes we can feel like Elijah, in that we're the only one who's worshiping God where we live. And sometimes it can overtake us. In those moments, we need to remember God's word to Elijah. He had 7,000 plus
place we'll be is called the Descalced Carmelite Order. It was built in the 19th century. The place Maraca means the sacrifice or the burning. That's what it means. Descalced, what does that mean? Anybody know? It literally means shoeless or unshod. That's what it means. The monks there, you won't see them. Nobody ever sees them. They're just a rumor that they live there. Anyway, they take a vow not to wear shoes. Occasionally they'll wear sandals, but they don't wear shoes at all. And they take that back from when God told Moses, "Kick off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground." Okay, they take it from that, which is in fact the Latin term that was used in the Vulgate version of Exodus 3 there. All right, anyway, that's where we're going to be. And this is what it looks like. We know the story, so I'm not going to go through that again because I got too much other stuff to do. But at the end of the contest, Elijah has the people seize the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape, and they seized them, and Elijah brought down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. Now then, what you're going to see here, that snake, that curvy looking line of trees, that's the Kishon River, the Kishon Brook, okay? You're up on top of the mountain right now looking down there. So right below, one of the reasons I say that it fits, this location fits the Bible, is because you look down and you can see the Kishon River. You look across, you see the Jezreel Valley, which is going to figure into some of the prophet stories about Elijah and Elisha. But also you remember at the end of the contest, Elisha sends his servant and says, "I want you to go up to the top of this hill and look out to the Mediterranean Sea and come back and tell me what you saw." Remember, he sent him up there 3 times. Third time, the guy comes back and he says, "I see a cloud that looks like a man's fist." Remember that? And when he does that, Elijah runs down to Ahab and says, "It's time to get out of here because there's a trash mover and a gully washer coming." You have to know the Hebrew to know what it says. Anyway, so, and they get down and they race across the Jezreel Valley. Do I have that one up here? No, I don't. Okay, I'm not there anyway. And they race across the Jezreel Valley, 25 miles. Ahab's in a chariot and Elijah outruns him on foot. That was one bad dude. All right. Anyway, and the rain comes. All right. So this is a statue that they have, a monument that they have at this monastery of Elijah killing the prophet of Baal there. All right. Now here is what the view is again. There's the Kishon River I told you about. Back up the hill. This is the edge of the flat area where the contest would have taken place. Back up at the top of the hill where the monastery is where the servant of Elijah would have looked back and been able to see the Mediterranean. So what you got to have is you got to have a place in Carmel that's close to the Kishon River, and that you can't see the Mediterranean from the location, but you can see it from a peak right here. And so those things all go to show that this is probably the location where it took place. This is the way it looks from the area where the sacrifice would have taken place. This is the area where the traditional place of sacrifice was. It's a large area where a lot of people could gather. So for the contest, they're there watching what's going on. This is the traditional place of the altar as the mountain starts to pick up there. And they've even found ancient sacrificial ash pits there from sacrifices that took place at that time. So it all fits, all right? Now then, that's kind of an overview of Mount Carmel. Now I want to tell you about something else that happened. When we stand on Carmel, we'll talk about several of these places that we won't actually visit. When we stand on Carmel, I want you to look and see that village of Shunem at the base of Mount Morah. Village of Shunem. Today it's called Sulam, S-U-L-A-A-M. Still exists. This is the way it looks today, an aerial view of it. And there's a view of it right at the base of the hill of Morah. Now, why do I want you to look at that? Well, I don't know if you remember it or not. This is the way it looked about 100 years ago, actually, which would look very much like what it looked like in Bible times. Now, this is the topography there. If you looked at that map in the Satellite Bible Atlas, you'd see that Mount Carmel, the mountain of Morocco, is here. Across the Jezreel Valley is Shunem, about 15 miles there. Jezreel is down here, about 15 miles across the Shunem, and it's flat. You can see somebody coming from a long distance. I don't know if you remember Elijah's successor was a circuit riding preacher. Did you remember that? And his circuit took him around this Jezreel Valley. And if you read through the Bible, you'll see the places that Elisha visited are all around the Jezreel Valley. And one of the places he stopped is a place called Shunem. And in Shunem, there was a family that took him in every time he passed through. They even built him a special guest room on top of the house. Remember the story? It was a woman married to an older man. They were childless, which is a problem for a woman in the first century, in the ancient world, right? Why is the problem? What's the problem? Husband dies, okay, it could be inheritance, but it's also to be cared for, right? The husband dies, she has no sons to care for her, to take care of her. She's destitute, okay? So here she is much younger than her husband. They don't have any children. And, but she talks her husband into building a guest room on top of the house for Elisha. And then they do that. And so every time Elisha comes through Shunem, he stays there. And so he gets to wondering, what can I do for this woman? And he asks his servant Gehazi, what shall I do for this woman? Gehazi says, hey, you know, they don't have any kids. So Elisha calls the woman in and says, this time next year, you'll have a child. And she does. And the child grows for a few years. And then one day, the child suffers apparently a brain hemorrhage, has a terrible headache, they take him to his mother, and he dies in her lap. Okay? The Bible says that the woman saddled up her animals and headed across from Shunem to Carmel, where the prophet was, Elisha. Now, Elisha can see her coming. The dust is rising. He can see her coming. He knows something's wrong. He sends Gehazi down to ask her what's going on. And she says, everything's okay. It's not actually what she says. I'll tell you in a minute what she says. She finally gets up to the prophet himself, and he says, are you okay? Is your husband okay? Is your son okay? He doesn't know this child's died. And she says, it is well. Now, the reason I told you about that, one of the most famous songs that we sing comes from that passage right there, where she says in 2 Kings 4, it is well. Almost 150 years ago, there was an attorney named Horatio Spafford. Horatio and Anna Spafford lived in Chicago. He was an elder at a Presbyterian church in Chicago. They were close friends of Dwight Moody and Philip Bliss. You may have heard of Moody and Bliss. They were kind of the Billy Graham, and what was Billy Graham's sidekick, the singer?
George Beverly Shea.
Yeah, George Beverly Shea. They were kind of the, Billy Graham and George Beverly Shea of their day. And they were close friends, spent time in their home all the time. And Horatio Spafford in 1872 bought a whole bunch of property. No, I'm sorry, in 1870, bought a whole bunch of property in the south side of Chicago. And just after he bought that, guess what happened? The Chicago fire wiped him out. Well, that wasn't the first bad thing that happened to Horatio. Horatio and Anna had already had one child who died as an infant. So after a few years, they've had 4 more children. And they're going to go, because he's had some more business reversals, they're going to go across to Europe and spend some time with what's his name? D.L. Moody, Dwight Moody, in a European campaign. And so at the last minute, Horatio had to stay home. And the wife and 4 daughters got on the boat that was called the Via de Havre, and they set sail for Europe. Well, in the middle of the Atlantic, there was a collision with another ship. The boat went down in about 7 minutes, as I recall. All 4 children drowned. The wife was unconscious, but a piece of flotsam floated up under her and kept her elevated enough till she could get rescued. When she gets to England, she telegraphs back home that all the children are dead. She was saved alone. And then Horatio Spafford very quickly gets on the next ship out. When he's crossing over the site where his daughters died, the captain told him this is where it happened. And Horatio went to his stateroom and he wrote the words, "When peace like a river attends my way." The words of "It is well with my soul." Now, most people stop the story there. It doesn't stop there. After that happened, Horatio and Anna lost 2 more children who died as children. And at that point in time, the people in their church decided that there must be some terrible sin in their lives for all these bad things to keep happening to them. They made it uncomfortable enough that Horatio and Anna had to leave the church. What they did is they sold everything that they had and they went to Israel, at that time called Palestine. And they started a mission to the Arabs that lived there called the American Colony that still exists today. In its day, it was the only Christian outreach to the Arabs that lived in Palestine. And it provided medical treatment, it provided food, clothing, shelter, it just meant whatever needs there were. And that's what they did. Horatio and Anna, when they died, were survived by 1 child out of 8. That's the story. Anyway, so whenever you sing this song, you got to think about Horatio and Anna and what they went through. When peace like a river attended my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul, with my soul. It is well with my soul. Oh, Satan should buffet, oh, trials should come. Let this blessed assurance control that Christ
Jesus throne, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul.
One of the things I love about Mount Carmel and Megiddo is that when you look from those two places, you can see the sites where so many things took place. You can say, that's where Saul and his boys died. That's where Gideon selected 300. That's where Deborah and Barak fought against Sisera. That's where Jesus was raised. You can see all those places across the Jezreel Valley. So when we're there, be sure to look for those things. All right? Thank you so much for being here. This is Mount Carmel.